While most eyes are understandably on Washington, D.C., with President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu meeting, discussing who knows what and coming to who knows what conclusions, but it has significant ramifications for everybody around the world. Too few eyes are on the other half of this equation, and that is on the Iranian side. Iran has been reduced to a caricature in most of the Western media and most of the Western press as just this evil regime that doesn't deserve any kind of discussion. But if we want to have any idea what's really going on and what we can expect, whether there's negotiations or whether there's conflict, we need to understand the Iranian side. And we are privileged today to have with us Professor Seyed Marandi, professor at Tehran University and a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiating team. So somebody with a lot of firsthand experience about what's going on. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor being here.
Well, listen, we are very grateful for your insights. And one of the things that I have most respected of you when I've seen you on interviews in a bunch of other places is that you call it like it is. You don't sugarcoat things. You don't make them unnecessarily bitter. You just are pretty much open and honest about things. And I think there is so much need for that kind of intellectual rigor and honesty right now. We're very grateful to have you on board. Let's just jump right into this and try to see if we can figure out kind of what's going on here and what may come. I think last night President Trump gave us a bit of an indication of what he may be thinking with Benjamin Netanyahu right now as to what he told Larry Kudlow on Fox News last night.
As you know, we have a massive flotilla right now going over to Iran. We'll see what happens. I think they want to make a deal. I think they'd be foolish if they didn't. We took out their nuclear power last time, and we'll have to see if we take out more this time.
Do you think a deal with Iran with this current regime would ever really stick?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I know one thing. They want to make a deal. They wouldn't talk to anybody else, but they're talking to me. But, you know, it's a good question. A lot of people say no. And I would say that I'd rather make a deal. It's got to be a good deal. No nuclear weapons, no missiles, no this, no that, all the different things that you want. But some people worry that they've been very dishonest with us over the years, right? Very dishonest. Obama and Biden, what they did in terms of creating a monster with Iran was terrible. That Iran nuclear deal was one of the dumbest deals I've ever seen.
Now, since you have some experience and direct reaction or actions regarding that terrible Obama deal that he was referring to and this monster that it created, let me just ask your opinion from the Iranian side of 2015, because and I think an honest rendering of that from the U.S. side in 2015, it put severe restraints and constrictions on the Iranian side, and most of the benefits came to the Western side, at least in terms of whether or not there would be a nuclear weapons program. How did you see it back then?
I think you're absolutely correct. The 2015 deal, contrary to what Trump is saying, it was after this deal was signed where Iran gave many concessions, in my opinion, too many, and the United States gave not nearly as much as they should have. After this deal, the United States literally from day one began to violate the spirit of the deal and gradually the text of the deal itself under Obama. And then when Trump came, he ultimately tore up the deal. So when he says that the Iranians have been cheating us and the Iranians cannot be reliable, it's really the other way around. The Iranians gave significant concessions. Again, as I said, I think far too many. And the United States, they did not abide by their commitments, whereas the Iranians did. In fact, when Trump tore up the deal, the Europeans promised Iran that if it stuck with the deal, they would find a solution. And for a full year, after maximum pressure sanctions were imposed and Trump tore up the deal, Iran stuck to all of its commitments, and the Europeans did nothing. So after a year, Iran began to, every 2 months, decrease its commitments to the deal. And then after a second year, in other words, after 2 years, after Trump tore up the deal, Iran effectively restarted its peaceful nuclear program in full. So it's really the reverse.
These are some really important things here. And I want to preface this part by asking a separate question. to see if you can either validate or correct something that I remember from that time when it happened, is that despite the claims that by the conservatives, even at the time Obama made this deal, that it was basically giving away the kitchen sink and giving everything away to Iran. But I remember that it was really hard from the Iranian side, from the president at the time, to get the Iranian, I guess the clerical regime and all the other leaders on board with it, because he had to promise that no, there would be a benefit for us and there would be something good to come out of it. Is that correct?
You're correct that there were deep divisions in Iran, and Iran, contrary to the sort of image that you have in the United States where they call it the mullahs or the clerical regime, it is an Islamic republic with a constitution. There are many checks and balances. The leader is elected by a body. It can be removed by that body. The president is elected directly. So is parliament, and so are councils. And we had deep divisions at all levels over the nuclear negotiations. And at that time, President Rouhani, he was fully supportive of giving concessions to get a quick deal. And the foreign ministry, partially due to President Rouhani's, let's say, sense of urgency, which I think was misplaced, they did not negotiate, in my opinion, as hard as they should have. And so we had a somewhat lopsided deal, but in order to prevent the country from being divided, the leader basically allowed it to go through, even though it was clear that he was not happy with it. But he didn't want to make this a divisive issue in the country. But it still, till this day, is something that people are debating about and are attacking each other severely in media as well as in other public arenas.
Well, and I think that's really important to understand the divisions and the regrets, if you want to say that, of those who supported it the last time. And given, and I think we're going to have a soundbite from your Iranian foreign ministry here in a minute talking about trust, but in the fact that the last year there was an attack on Iran while they were, I think, in between the 5th and 6th rounds of negotiations, or so we thought. So that didn't work out well. Trump tore up the 2015 agreement in 2018. So where is there any level of trust for any kind of a deal, even if it's just limited to nuclear enrichment? Can the Iranian side agree to something?
Well, the Iranians will not negotiate their missile capabilities for obvious reasons, because if Iran limits them, then the United States and Israel would attack. And it will not negotiate its regional alliances and friendships, but it is willing to negotiate the nuclear program, but not its right to enrich uranium or its right to have a nuclear program. But it's willing to negotiate assurances. And like the 2015 deal, but upgraded, because Iran has technologically advanced in the last decade and it has been harmed by the United States. So Iran would demand a better deal, but Iran is more than willing to have assurances in the deal, so that if the United States is really worried about a nuclear weapon, which many in Iran really don't believe that is the issue for the United States, it's something quite different. But if the United States is seriously concerned about nuclear weapons, that is something that can be sorted out, because that's what the International Atomic Energy Agency does. In fact, the facilities that the United States bombed months ago, all of them had IAEA monitors going through these buildings regularly, and they all had cameras. In other words, every centimeter of those facilities were closely monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they've always said that they are completely peaceful, but he bombed them anyway.
So the question is now, though, what negotiating room will the Iranian side have that they can feel good about? Because they also have to get something for it. Nobody's going to negotiate anything away. And you mentioned about the nuclear program. Your president said this, I think it was this morning, at least I got the video this morning, about the nuclear program.
We are not willing to own a nuclear weapon. We cannot allow for our relations with our regional and neighboring countries to collapse. Yet we are faced with a conspiracy from imperial powers. We're using all our strength to reinforce peace and harmony in the region. It is the people of the region only who can solve our own problems. Together with Muslim countries, we can resolve our problems without any intervention by alien Westerners.
So now how And this may be an impossible ask here, but how can Western countries, and especially the United States and Iran, believe when he says we don't have and don't even want a nuclear bomb? Because it's taken as an article of faith from most on the conservative side, and especially in Israel, that it's a guarantee they are definitely going for a nuclear weapon. What do you say?
Well, the Israelis are not known for honesty, and that's not a part of their culture. But I think if we look at a historic evidence, it shows that actually Iran is the opposite of how the West behaves. In the 1980s, I was a volunteer in the Iran-Iraq War when Saddam Hussein invaded the country. And the West, especially Germany, gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against us, nerve agents as well as mustard gas. And many died, both Iraqis and Iranians, at the hands of Saddam. And I survived 2 attacks. One was a mustard gas attack near the end of the war, and the other was a nerve agent that was used earlier on during the Khaybar operations, where I and others, we couldn't breathe. But the point is that those chemical weapons were provided to Saddam Hussein mainly by the Germans, with help from other European countries. And the United States gave military intelligence to use those chemical weapons and, of course, political cover to get away with it. At that time, at the height of the Saddam Hussein chemical weapons program, Iranian officials went to Ayatollah Khomeini, the previous leader who passed away in 1989, and asked him and told him that we need to produce our own chemical weapons. And he refused. He said that we don't accept these weapons. These are barbaric weapons, and you'll just have to live without them. And so Iran did not produce chemical weapons. In fact, when the West was giving Saddam chemical weapons, they were preventing us from purchasing gas masks. And so my gas mask was from North Korea. It wasn't a particularly good gas mask. I don't know, maybe they have good gas masks now. But in any case, the Iranians were desperately getting gas masks from the black market here and there back then. So we have this history where Iranian leaders, under very difficult circumstances, refused to produce weapons of mass destruction. With regards to nuclear weapons, the Iranians could have produced nuclear weapons a long time ago. They have that technological capability, but they have chosen not to do so. And all the evidence indicates that Iran's nuclear program is peaceful. Even the United States intelligence said that post 2003, Iran has not been producing nuclear weapons or attempting to do so. But the reality is that, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, there's no evidence that Iran was attempting to do so before 2003. So and Iran, another reason why Iran does not want nuclear weapons, morality aside, is the fact that if Iran produces nuclear weapons, then we have 15 neighbors. Many of them are family dictatorships, like in the Persian Gulf, they're all family dictatorships. Or in Central Asia or in the Caucasus, we have family dictatorships. None of these are inherently stable. The UAE may seem stable, but it's a dictatorship. Who knows what happens tomorrow? So if Iran produces nuclear weapons, then you have a host of countries all around us, many of them quite tiny, who will feel the need to produce their own weapons. So the issue is not simply just about the Israeli regime or the United States, but it's about having a neighborhood full of nuclear weapons. So that is another reason why Iran has refrained from producing such weapons. However, the Iranians have said, or some officials in Iran have said, that if there is an existential threat to the nation, then Iran will change its nuclear posture. That's the phrase that was used. And until now, we don't see an existential threat to the nation.
Although that could certainly change after this meeting with President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll see what happens with that. But before we get to that, though, I want to circle back around because of a comment that was made by Foreign Minister Arakchi. I think it was this morning. He was referring back to what happened last June. You talked about where Trump claimed that he completely obliterated the entire nuclear program for the Iranian side. But Foreign Minister Arakchi had a different view.
They tried it once last year and they failed. Iran's nuclear program cannot be bombed and destroyed, because it's a technology that we have developed by ourselves. So there is no solution but a diplomatic solution.
So what does he mean by that? There's no solution but a diplomatic solution because it can't be bombed. Obviously, many things can be bombed, but is he referring to the physical infrastructure, or is he talking about the intellectual capacity that even if you destroy a facility, this facility can be rebuilt and we have the wherewithal to recalibrate it?
Well, I think directly he's talking about the intellectual capacity and capability, but that's what he's saying directly. But I think he's also implying that Iranian nuclear facilities that are very deep underground are probably not damaged in the way in which Trump would like us to believe. But the fact is that Iran's capabilities today are completely different from what they were 10, 15 years ago. And that's thanks to Trump, by the way, because if it wasn't for Trump tearing up the deal, Iran's nuclear advances would have stayed to where more or less where they were in 2015. So the progress that Iran made is because of Trump and no one else. But Iran's capability, for example, to produce enriched uranium today is far greater than it was before. The machines are much more advanced. It takes much less space. It's not something that can easily be discovered by the United States if the Iranians went underground. So this is not a policy that will function. And Iran is a huge country. And because of the attack on the country, Iran no longer allows the International Atomic Energy Agency the access that it had before. And that is also thanks to Trump. So if Iran wanted to do something, it would be very difficult for the United States to figure out what is being done, how it's being done, and how extensively it's being carried out.
Now, I don't know if you have any knowledge of this or not, but there's a lot of claims in some quarters of the Western media that when the United States attacked the nuclear facilities in June of last year, that there was a tacit deal that the United States said, all right, we're going to come and we're going to bomb this thing here. You have to respond. So we're going to allow you to shoot something here at our base in Qatar. It's not going to cause any casualties. And then we're going to be done. We're not going to go into a full war. What do you know of that?
Well, I don't know a great deal, but I do know that the Iranians and the Americans did not want war. And the Iranians were focusing on defeating the Israeli regime. And as you know, and as pundits and others in the know, like Steve Bannon, for example, pointed out on more than one occasion, during the last 3-4 days of the war, things were getting very bad for the Israeli regime, and it was Netanyahu who was seeking a ceasefire, not the Iranians. And the Iranian missiles were getting through. They were hitting targets. They were very precise. And so it was they who wanted to stop. But Iran didn't want to expand the war. At that time, there were, from my understanding, discussions in Iran to broaden the war, to even close the Strait of Hormuz. But that was something that they didn't want to do because they didn't want to impact the global economy. They felt that they could manage the Israeli regime. And as I said, the Iranian nuclear facilities are very deep underground, and I find it very unlikely that the United States, with using those weapons, could seriously damage them. And I think, and I may be wrong, this was a long time ago, I think that the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency at that time contradicted Trump's statement, and he was sidelined. Now, maybe you could,
I remember that.
Your colleagues could check this. So he basically said it was set back a few months, which would indicate that what I'm saying is probably something that in the United States is also seen as a valid assessment.
Yeah, I mean that's the most likely outcome because if you had built those with a certain understanding of what the United States could do, it only makes sense that they're going to be deep enough, and it's going to be very difficult. We actually had an expert on here from MIT that explained the mechanics and the geography of why it would be so hard and nearly impossible for the U.S. to have utterly destroyed them. Won't go through all that here, but that seems to be the most plausible. Now then the question is, though, what now? Now I'm going to play something here that the vice president said earlier today. But before I do it, I want to back up a little bit to get a running start, because there's one thing that's really important here. When you're talking about negotiating something, Trump said in that first soundbite from last night that he said Iran wants a deal. We want to make a deal. We want to get it done. The question is, what deal are you making? What is the actual issue at stake here? Because on December the 28th and 29th, the deal was Iran is killing a lot of innocent protesters, and if that's a red line, and we're going to go in and take care of that. And now all of a sudden it seems to be on, I thought something that we destroyed and obliterated last year is actually the deal again, that it's the negotiating side for a nuclear program. So the question is, first of all, what did happen with the protest that happened last year? Because I've heard a lot of different stories, and we'd like to hear it from the Iranian perspective.
Sure. Well, now that the information is coming out, I think we have a clearer picture. The U.S. Treasury Secretary twice in recent days has said that he gloated about it, that he once in Davos and then later on, he said that we brought down the Iranian currency. And the fall in the Iranian currency.
Yeah, we've shown that soundbite on the show, by the way.
Exactly. And so people came to the streets. Now, what happened was that there were small protests for a couple of days, and they were peaceful protests. No one was arrested. And they were basically shop owners and business people who were worried about their businesses, because the currency is very key for people to be able to look to the future and to be able to conduct business. And the government said, you're right, and we're trying to solve the problem. But then on day 3, we had this sudden influx of very well-trained groups of people in different cities and in different places in big cities who were suddenly beginning riots. And they were doing damage. But the killing began on January the 8th. On January the 8th, suddenly a lot of police officers were being killed at night. And that's because the police officers did not have guns, yet they were being shot at, beaten, knifed, and I don't know the exact numbers for the 8th, because the fighting was on the 8th and the 9th. And effectively, they were forced to retreat in different areas. And there was a similar pattern across the country, not only about killing, but the way in which they burned banks. Hundreds of banks were burned down in those 2 nights. And the way in which they did it was similar in different cities. In other words, they were all trained to burn down banks, schools, mosques, hundreds of ambulances, fire engines, very expensive fire engines, some of them, and public buses. But they were all done in a systematic way and also similarly. In other words, they were being trained in a certain particular way. And then on the 9th, the Iranian intelligence, the Ministry of Intelligence, the guards, the intelligence organization, and the police, all 3 issued statements that went out to all cell phones, including my own, everyone's cell phone, that tonight do not allow your kids to be on the streets. We are going to deal with these rioters. And they were effectively gun battles on the night, on the January the 9th. And ultimately, in the West, they were saying thousands of people, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, 80,000, which I believe, and others do believe, that this was basically A, to sort of whitewash what the Israelis were doing in Gaza, but B, it was the numbers were being inflated to create an environment for the United States to have an excuse to attack Iran. But then the government gave the names of every person who was killed and their data, their ID numbers, and so on. 3,117. Some of them don't have IDs because they're not sure who they are. I don't know if that's been sorted out, but I mean, this is like a couple of information from a couple of weeks ago. Ever since the government gave out their data, suddenly everyone's gone quiet. Now they're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 because they know that 80,000 doesn't make sense. But the number is 3,117. Nothing more than that. And but the people who should be blamed are Western intelligence agencies, because these rioters, according to Pompeo in his tweet, They had
Right.
Mossad among. According to Mossad's own Persian language statement, they were on the streets. According to Israeli Channel 14, it was foreign agencies, meaning Israel and probably the Americans, that brought in the weapons that they said, Channel 14, which is close to Netanyahu, hundreds of police officers and security officials were killed. I mean, imagine if it was the United States. And proportionally speaking, if the United States has 350 million, Iran is 90 million. Let's say 1,400 police officers were killed in 2 days. What would the response be in the United States? I mean, you had that young woman who was shot in the face and there's a debate as to whether she was turning to the right enough or not. In Iran, you had all these people, police officers massacred, many of them beaten to death, knifed to death, burned alive. And we have images of some of these online. Some of them they won't show because they're really bad. But the point is that these and Pompeo then again on Channel 13 of Israel said the Americans have been supporting these people too. So Western intelligence say it's not as if people were marching on the streets and then the police were gunning them down. And one interesting thing is that the speech that you just showed of President Pezeshkian was this, as you rightly pointed out, was this morning. It was in Tehran during the commemoration of the revolution. Today is the 47th anniversary of the revolution. There were 4 million people in Tehran attending this rally. And I don't know if your producer has the footage. I tweeted some of it, but they were taking helicopter shots. The crowds were stunning. And these rallies were held simultaneously in cities across the country. So tens of millions of people were attending. And the turnout this year was larger than previous years because people came out to support the Islamic Republic and to condemn Trump and the Netanyahu regime and those who are pushing for confrontation with the country. So while the West is...
What do you say to those in the West who say, "Oh, that's because they were forced to. It's a theocratic regime and they didn't get a choice. They had to come out and say that." What do you say to those arguments?
Well, if the Islamic Republic of Iran is so good at organizing people and bringing I don't know how they can force all these people to the streets and count them. And like, where do they go someplace and give their names and IDs and sign on and say, I came, and they get money? How are they forced to the streets? And then those who don't come, what happens to them? Well, if you walk in Tehran, you'll see people in their shops and out and about, and they're not attending. So what happens to them? This is just the sort of propaganda that you have in the West that is basically just trying to downplay the reality of Iran. The narrative in the West is this is a corrupt, evil regime that's collapsing and it's imploding and the people hate it and it's the mullahs. And ironically, the president is not a mullah, whatever that is. The chair of the Supreme National Security Council is not a mullah. If you go to parliament, none of them are mullahs. I don't even know what that means when they say this, mullah regime. But then the narrative is that it's evil and it's unpopular. But at the same time, there's this contradiction. There's this paradox because it's also a rising threat. If it's imploding, if it's despised, if the people hate it, then how can it also be a rising threat to the world at the same time? And if the government can bring these millions of people, this is Tehran, to the streets, this square is miles away from where the president was speaking. Miles away. That's how big the crowd was. But if this evil regime can bring all these people to the streets of Tehran, and it takes hours to get there, the traffic and it's then how come they can't control these protesters? I mean, it's just so outlandish, the propaganda against Iran. But you do have journalists who've gone to Tehran. Some of them are people from the alternative media, some of them mainstream media. It's nothing that anyone can hide. But at the end of the day, Western mainstream media, in my opinion, when it comes to Iran, they're all the same. It doesn't matter if it's The Guardian or Fox News, if it's the New York Times or MSNBC. They're all the same. One may be more bombastic, one may be less bombastic, but they're controlled by the elites, and the hostility towards Iran is immense.
Let's look at what the ramifications of the realities as you're saying that they are, that there is widespread support for the regime. Now, one of the claims that's being made over and over is that this is the weakest the regime has been, the Iranian regime. This is the weakest they've been in all the 40-something years. Now is the time to go and get them. And that has led to comments like this one. Gary, let's go straight to the one where, let's see, the one with the Kroger. Sorry, this is from an Australian, from Sky News here. But what he says here is very common among a lot of the advocates for action against Iran.
He's going to take out the Iranian leadership. I personally can't believe, given everything that's happened in the Middle East, given everything Trump's done on the international stage, I cannot believe this president of the United States is going to make a deal with the Iranian regime. He knows, as Rubio knows, as Vance knows, that as soon as Trump and the Republicans leave office, any deal they do with the Iranians will be forgotten and extinguished by the Iranians. They don't fear Kamala Harris. They don't fear Gavin Newsom. They don't fear Jasmine Crockett. Any deal with Iran will last till 2028, and that'll be over. So I can't believe that he's going to leave 90 million Iranians hanging by a thread. This regime have like Hamas in Gaza, these people have kept, the Iranian people as prisoners.
Now, let me ask you your opinion. As somebody with some military experience, can the United States come in with a lot of aerial attacks, bombs, missiles, and other kinds of attacks, not on the ground, but through the air, and actually decapitate the Iranian government such that the people would then form their own government? Is that even militarily possible?
Just one thing, before you showed this madman, your producer briefly showed, I think that was Rick Sanchez. And maybe, because he is in Tehran right now, maybe later on you can invite him for him to give his thoughts on what he saw on the streets of Tehran. So this is him in Tehran. I missed him because I'm in Moscow. He works in Moscow. I'm in Moscow now, and he's in Tehran. So, and when I get back to Tehran, I assume he'll be back in Moscow. But it would be good for you to, if you have, if you think it's a good idea, to have him on your show at some point to see what he has to say about all this, because he would be an independent observer in all this. He's worked on CNN and Fox News, and he's been around. But no, I have no doubt that there's no hope that the United States can bring about regime change. Let's say the United States kills a number of senior leaders in Iran. We have a constitution. They'll be replaced by new people, but the armed forces will fight. And one thing that I think many of these Western pundits and so-called Iran experts and people in the Western media don't take into account is that Iran's capabilities against the Israeli regime are a sideshow. Iran's and of course Iran still defeated the Israelis, even though they carried out a blitzkrieg attack. Iran's main military capabilities are not directed at Israel. Israel is not a threat to Iran. It's a tiny regime that needs full support from the West, many billions of dollars a year, just to keep afloat. The threat to Iran has always been the United States. The United States is a superpower. It may be on the decline, the empire may be on the decline, but it's still a superpower. Ever since, in particular, 9/11, when the United States came and invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and surrounded Iran literally, and it was the hyperpower, someone once said back then. And then Bush began saying all options are on the table and Iran was the axis of evil. And then Obama also said all options were on the table multiple times. Iran began developing underground missile and drone bases and creating an asymmetrical naval force and submarine force to defend itself against the United States. Those underground missile bases are short-range missiles, middle-range missiles, anti-ship missiles, and they're all directed at the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean and the other side of the Persian Gulf. So you have hundreds of thousands of drones that are prepared to destroy everything surrounding Iran to the south and to the southeast, especially since Iran knows that the Persian Gulf is a very, very sensitive and vulnerable place. It's probably the most sensitive place on the planet because, I don't know, 20 million barrels of oil a day is exported from West Asia, and the Caucasus probably a bit more. And so if oil and gas exports are halted from the Persian Gulf region and from Western Asia, then that will bring about a global economic collapse. And Iran can easily do that. Not only can the Iranians shut down the Strait of Hormuz easily, but they can also destroy all the ships in the Persian Gulf. And they can also destroy the ports and the oil and gas installations. And they can do that in the Caucasus too. And then if you add that to the fact that Iran supporters in Iraq have said they will wage war, the same people who defeated ISIS. And then Yemen, they said they'll be a part of this, and they've been preparing themselves for war too. This will be a regional war. This is not something that Trump can
let me
manage.
ask you, I know you're limited on time here. I definitely don't want to let you go before we look at what would be the potential Iranian military response in the event that President Trump makes good on this threat anyway, to actually start attacking with a substantial attack. Jack Keane has said this would be a campaign. It wouldn't be a one-off like it was in June of last year, but would be a substantial campaign. It would go after military leaders, political leaders, IRGC targets, naval bases, and certainly the missile forces. That would be the target array. But in the event that happened, what would be the Iranian response?
I think what Iran will do is it will target U.S. bases. It will target the U.S. Naval assets, but that won't be the real target. It will target the Israeli regime, but that won't be the weak point. What Iran will do is it will end the oil trade and it will end the gas trade and bring down the global economy to make 1929 look like a recession.
And what do you say to those who say, well, they can't do that because then that would be cutting their own throat because they're already limited with the income, and that would then completely shut off all of their income as well?
This will be a fight for survival. And the Arab regimes on the other side of the Persian Gulf, they all host U.S. bases, and they are all far more dependent on oil and gas than Iran is on oil and gas, because Iran has been under sanctions for all these years. These Arab regimes host U.S. bases. As we speak, those U.S. bases are being used against us and preparing themselves to fight against us. So Qatar, with a population of 400,000, what is it going to do? If push comes to shove, if Iran starts firing missiles at and drones, thousands of drones at its facilities, the regime will fall. You have 400,000 people there, and you have millions of foreign workers. In the Emirates, you have 1.4 million people and 10 million foreign workers, mostly male adults. These regimes won't last. And when these regimes collapse, the whole U.S. Structure in West Asia will collapse because it's dependent on these oil and gas-rich family dictatorships. So
now, I've had two separate experts on our show here in the last week or so. One suggested that that the United States, with this current armada that's arrayed out there, both in the sea and at the bases that's been plussed up, they could go maybe 5-6 days of really high intensity, high saturation bombing and missile strikes, etc. Another one suggested maybe it would be up to 14 days. The question is, can Iranian missiles and drones last beyond 14 days?
Yes, Iran can do this for months. And Iran has been preparing itself during the last few months. As I said, the long-range missiles that were used against the Israeli regime, that's the sideshow. The real capabilities are what is directed at the United States. Because, as I said, the Iranians, ever since the United States came and invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, the Iranians have been preparing themselves. I have no doubt that at the end of the day, this will bring down Trump's presidency, and it will bring about great change in the United States. And people in the United States won't be fooled by any claims about Iran. Iran is at the negotiating table. People see what the Epstein files are revealing to them, who's really in charge in the United States. This is not the United States of 20, 30 years ago, and this is not Iran of 20, 30 years ago. I certainly do not want war. I hate war. I fought in war. I've been to Lebanon, Iraq, Syria many times. War is a horrible thing. But if the United States imposes war, for Iran, it will be an existential fight, and they will hit as hard as possible. And I have no doubt that the United States is simply incapable of stopping Iran. There's no way that the United States can prevent Iran from stopping the flow of oil and gas.
And what would be
And
the Iranian end state? What would be the objective? To fight until the U.S. stops? To fight until things are destroyed? What would be the objective of the Iranian government?
to end the war.
So if the U.S. would stop fighting, then so too would Iran under that circumstance.
Well, I guess. I mean, we're speaking about hypotheticals, but
Right.
what Iran would do is that it would hit so hard so that and the swiftest amount of time, the shortest amount of time, the United States would reassess its actions. Iran doesn't want war, but again, this would be a fight for our survival. For the United States, it would be a war of choice once again. But what I would say is that Americans should be very wary about their media. Their media is controlled by the oligarchy, by what I would call the Epstein class. This is the same media that was saying that Russia would collapse in weeks and that the ruble would turn into rubble and that the Russians were using washing machines for chips and they were desperate. Well, now let's look what's happening in Ukraine. So if I were an American, I would not trust anything that comes out of mainstream media, and I would look more carefully at the map and look at the Iraqis. Iran's allies won the elections in Iraq weeks ago, and Iraqis know that if anything bad happens to Iran, that's bad news for Iraq. They said they'll fight, and those forces that General Soleimani trained in Iraq, they will fight. So you have Iraq with 47 million people. You have Yemen, which is preparing itself, and fight against who? Against Doha, against UAE with a few 100,000 people, Kuwait. All of these countries combined, Bahrain, they don't have the population of Sana'a in Yemen or Baghdad in Iraq. They're not a fighting force. So the smart thing to do would be for the United States to refrain from obeying the Zionists and the Epstein class, and to find a solution. And the solution is at hand. We already had a nuclear deal in 2015, and that can be easily sorted out. But there's no way that the Iranians are going to disarm or anything.
Really, I can't imagine why they would want to. We had, and I guess this will be the last question here. We had Trita Parsi on the show about 10 days ago, I think, and he said that in the past, whether it was the assassination of General Soleimani or the destruction of the Iranian embassy in Syria or the attacks into Tehran during the inauguration, etc., all of these things had limited retaliation, limited reaction because Iran didn't want to get into a big war. But he said that there is a growing consensus inside of Iran that now that they're saying those self-restraint, so to speak, is counterproductive to Iran's security. And if there's an attack this time, they say they really mean it. His suggestion is that Iran really means it and they really will go all out, which I don't think that's most Americans don't believe that Iran can do that. But my question is, if that is correct, has that been conveyed at the private level between the United States and Iran that that's what they would do?
Well, 3 or 4 things very quickly. One is that when the Israelis and the Americans attacked Iran, they expected Iran to collapse and that it was some sort of house of cards. And even though they murdered lots of ordinary people and some senior commanders along with their families often, and their children and grandchildren, nothing happened. In fact, the reverse happened, and the Iranians mobilized and fought back. Iran is far more prepared today than it was back then. And as I said, Iran's real assets are not directed towards Palestine or the Mediterranean, but directed towards the Persian Gulf. The second is that the scenes that you saw in the footage of Tehran, the people are united and they will remain steadfast against the United States, regardless of what Western media says. The reality is the opposite in Iran. All the evidence shows that, but Western media won't tell Americans that because Western media has its own agenda, because it's not a free press. My understanding, and I cannot say this for certain, I may be wrong, but I have heard from pretty reliable sources, I can't swear to it, that Trump or the United States sent a message to the Iranians a while back that, look, we'll strike a couple of empty places or something like that, and then you do some token response, and that'll be it. And the Iranians said, no, if you attack us, it will be all out war. And the logic is, A, of course, it would be an active war, but B, the Iranians believe that what Trump and the US would like to do is every few months to make up some excuse, some false flag operation, some unrest somewhere to have an excuse to bomb Iran again. And Iran is saying we're not going to have that. So we will end it here and now. If Trump attacks, then he's going to have to face the consequences. But again, Iranians don't want war. But if there is war, I think it will be catastrophic for the global economy in a way in which none of us can imagine.
And sorry, one more question, maybe in the last 60 seconds or so. One of the things I've heard recently, and this is something I hadn't heard before, is that there is inside of Iran a kind of long-suffering mentality that if you start to kill them, instead of giving in because the suffering gets too high, that they'll just double down and say, no, we'll just keep going, even if it means all the way to death. How would you honestly characterize in the event that the United States attack? Because we do have a lot of power. There could be a great many Iranians that would die as a result of this. Can they be killed into submission?
Well, two things. One is that ever since I remember, they've been saying that Iran is falling apart. It's never been weaker. It's about to fall. I've been hearing this since the days of Mr. Rafsanjani and then Mr. Khatami and Ahmadinejad and Rouhani. So these narratives, I would just throw out the window. But I wouldn't say that Iranians have this mentality. But what I would say is that Iranians are Shia Muslims. And Shia Muslims have a very special place in their heart for the oppressed and for fighting against oppression. That is why Iran is so steadfast in its support for the Palestinians, or why they support the Venezuelans or the Cubans, even though the Cubans are communists. That is why they supported apartheid South Africa. It is a part of Iran's religious culture. The Shia in particular, they are one of the key nodes in history that is very important in Iranian culture, is the martyrdom of the grandson of the Prophet in Karbala, and the story of him and his sister and the household of the Prophet, and how they stood up in support of the oppressed and against the oppressor of the time, and how they were martyred there. If someone reads the story of Ashura, they will understand how that, and this is very deep in Iranian culture. No day in the Iranian calendar, religious or secular, is as celebrated, if you can say that, or is as commemorated as the martyrdom of Imam Hussein on the day of Ashura. Even the most secular people, those who party and who drink, on Ashura, for the most part, they're on the streets. So there is a certain resilience among Iranians that is unique, and a certain sympathy for the oppressed and the downtrodden that it will be very difficult to find anywhere else. But in any case, I think one final point that would be useful is that after 7 weeks of war against Ansarullah in Yemen, Trump called it quits. Iran is 1,000 times stronger than Yemen.
Yeah, that's something that we should all take into consideration. Listen, I don't want to keep you any longer. Really appreciate you coming on. We'd love to have you back and talk about more. I could keep going and asking lots of other questions, but we're very grateful for you sharing your viewpoint and the things that you see from your perspective. We really appreciate it.
It's a great honor being on your show. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe before you leave if you haven't done that, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You know we don't have sponsors because we hate to hit you over the head with ads. I don't like them. So show a little love back. Subscribe, like, and send this to somebody you care about.